Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Perfectly Holistic Radio Show. We are so excited to be back. I can't believe it's February. And we have a really, really awesome guest tonight, a personal friend of mine, Jessica Fisher. Jessica, thank you for joining us and welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me. I always love getting to come on and talk to you and getting to help educate more pet parents.
Absolutely. And just for the audience who is listening, you can call in to listen at 231 388 7685. That is the News for the Soul channel. And if you guys are watching on Facebook or YouTube, you are able to drop comments over here as we go. We're also streaming on Instagram, but you guys just remember I can't see I can't see your comments. So joining us tonight, we are going to be talking about a really important topic. I think, Jessica, you would agree that cat food, what we feed our pets, cats, dogs, whatever, is probably the most important fundamental thing that we need to look at. Would you
Yeah.
agree? Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, it's the foundation of health
Right.
because, yes, what we put into our bodies feeds our cells and determines how those new cells are being made. So it's literally the building blocks of life. And there are so many things that contribute to health, but we can mitigate so many things in the body by being very proactive with the food that we're feeding that I feel like it has to be the place we start and the place we spend probably the most amount of time.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this is because even today in the holistic space, I still encounter a lot of cat parents, especially who are feeding a species inappropriate diet. And I understand that there are budgetary constraints, and I know we've done countless shows on nutrition and labels and all that kind of stuff. But I think when you really step back and you look at what you're feeding your cat, and we're going to talk about what's really in your cat's food tonight, and dissect the myths versus the realities. We're going to pick apart what's on that bag of food or on that label of the package, and we're going to really investigate what those terms, and I say terms because in the pet food space, these are called definitions, and they're not always what we think they are. We might look at a specific product and see chicken on that label, but we don't, there's a disconnect, and it's not our fault. It's because of pet food regulation through AFCO, which is what's their animal associated
Yeah,
can
American
feeding.
Association of Feed Control Officials.
Right. So again, it's this regulatory body that decides how food is defined, how ingredients are defined, and it's not the same definition that you would look up in Webster's dictionary or assume that what you see on a package with this beautiful picture is not necessarily what is in that pet's food. And most of the time it's not, because of just how there's a lot of deceptive and marketing and things like that. So, with that being said, Jessica, where do you want to start with this?
Well, I think what you just said about what those pretty pictures on the labels don't equate to what's actually in that food is probably a pretty good place, because I would say at least 90, maybe more percent of a label, any part of that packaging is not regulated. It is all marketing. So there's very, very little that is actually regulated. And so AFCO is not actually a regulatory body. They just create all of the definitions of everything and guidelines. They submit it to the FDA for approval, and pretty much the FDA says, yes, this is what we're going to do. Every single state has the option to adopt those regulations or not. So, and that makes it really difficult for smaller pet food manufacturers, especially because one state may say, you have to list it this way, and another state may say you have to list it that way. And a small pet food company that, an indie pet food company can't make two different labels just because they're going to different states, right? So it's hard. It's really, really hard on a lot of pet food manufacturers, the smaller pet food manufacturers. But most of the packaging on pet food is completely unregulated. It is all marketing. So that's kind of one of the very first things you have to realize walking into wherever you're getting your pet's food is being able to look past the actual marketing. So those pretty pictures on the front, a lot of the words and terminology that are being used, we're going to talk about today, but definitely understand that that is not what is in the actual product. There's no regulation over the pictures that they use. A lot of them will say like not actual size, which I think in our minds kind of makes us think, okay, there's regulation to this. There's no regulation to that.
Right.
I think it's a psychological trick. But yeah, one of the first things I think, let me get my information pulled up. So one of the first things I want anybody to do when they grab a package of food, whether that's a dry bag, it could be a raw food bag, it could be a can of food, it could, whatever it is to flip that bag over. Literally pay like almost no attention to the front of the bag. The only thing really on the front of the bag you're going to want to really pay attention to is if it's complete and balanced or not, if it's for supplemental feeding. Because if it is for supplemental feeding, you can still buy it. Just understand that that shouldn't be 100% of your pet's diet. Mm-hmm. What you are looking for is something, generally speaking, if you're only feeding commercial foods, you want something that is quote unquote complete and balanced, which is a whole other episode on what we know and care about balance. But that it generally is what you're looking for if it's going to be your dog or cat's base diet. Then turn the package over and look at the guaranteed analysis, look at the ingredient label. And it can be overwhelming on both sides, whether you're looking at the guaranteed analysis or you're looking at the ingredient label. One thing that is coming in the next year or so, I think they were supposed to have like 3 years, and this whole thing with the AFCO MOU not being renewed has escalated the timeline. They are supposed to be, all pet food manufacturers are supposed to be changing over the guaranteed analysis labels to include carbohydrates. Mm-hmm. So right now you have to figure that out for yourself, which is pretty easy to do as long as you know how to do it, right? Most people don't know how to do it. So most of the time you're looking on a dry matter basis, if you're looking at, a dry food, and you're going to be adding protein, fat, moisture, and ash together. Mm-hmm. So whatever those percentages are, and if ash isn't listed, we're going to estimate 6%. That's a pretty standard for like a kibble or, dried pet food. Add all of that together, subtract it from 100, and you get your carbohydrate percentage. So it's a pretty easy calculation, as long as you know what the calculation is. And you can figure out how many carbohydrates are in that food. Now, not all carbohydrates are bad, right? There are vegetables with carbohydrates. And for the most part, we still don't want to overdo it. Like I wouldn't feed a ton of potatoes or anything like that. But starchy carbohydrates, grains, legumes, that's the filler that's in a kibble. And you really want to pay attention to what that percentage is. You might be shocked if you go to your pantry or hopefully your freezer, because we don't want those fats oxidizing, and flip over that bag and do this calculation. You might be shocked at the percentage of carbohydrates in that food, which I know you talk about all the time. Cats, as obligate carnivores, don't really need any. Dogs don't really need any either, but they can handle more than a cat can. But as an obligate carnivore, we should not be feeding any starchy carbohydrates to our cats. That's just completely biologically inappropriate, right? So that's the first thing. And then looking down at the ingredient label, it can get so tricky, like you were saying. One of the first things I would love for you to look for is the salt divide. And I think Rodney Habib actually coined that term, salt divide. So anywhere you're looking on a label, in the ingredient label, wherever salt is listed, and you're going to, so generally speaking, you're never going to see salt more than 1% of the total formulation. And just in case anybody is curious, how the ingredients are listed, they have to go by volume, like what is the greatest percentage down to the lowest percentage. So the very first thing listed, which can be tricky too, and we'll talk about that in a minute, is going to have the greatest percentage, overall percentage of that formulation for that recipe. Once you get down to salt, it's never, I've never seen it more than 1%. We have to have salt. Salt is necessary to sustain life. But I've never seen it more than 1%. Anything past that, then is less than 1%, just by default. So you can actually test this idea that I just threw out at you, that those pretty little pictures on the front of the label may not be what's actually in that food. If you look past salt and see, oh, there's the kale, oh, there's the blueberries, right? There's the carrots. They're less than 1% of that package. So you're seeing these big, beautiful blueberries and carrots on the front of the packaging. It is all marketing. Like, yes, it's in there, but is there any benefit from it? So that's one of the first things I think people should be looking at after the carbohydrates. Then we go back up to the top of the ingredient label, and so often, not always, because pet food companies, they make a whole heck of a lot of money, whole heck of a lot, of billions with a B every year from us pet parents. And pet parents a number of years ago got wise and said they wanted to see meat as the first ingredient in their pet food. And so these pet food companies, big pet food companies, and I don't know if we call out brands or names on this show, but I'm talking,
you certainly can.
Big pet food like Royal Canin and Hills and Purina and the big guys, Blue Buffalo. They're the really, really heavy hitter players, right? And they got really wise, and they're like, no way, we're going to give up any profits. So they started moving ingredients around on the label. Well, you can't just move ingredients around on the label, but what they can do is something called ingredient splitting. So they'll take peas and pea protein, and where that used to be all one ingredient on the label, now they've broken it up into peas and pea protein, so that they can bump chicken ahead as a total percentage greater than peas as a whole and pea protein as a whole. They do the same thing with corn and lots of different things. They will split up ingredients. So for you would say that's the same thing, but they're saying no, technically they're two separate things for us. So we're gonna break them up, and that means that they each have smaller percentages, and then we can bump whatever that meat is up to the first position. So I think some people have kind of gotten wise to that. A lot of people haven't. And it really, I will say, Pam, and I don't know how often you hear this from your clients, but I still get kind of shocked when I'm talking to a client and they know, they know exactly what the symptoms are that their dog, like I work with a lot of dogs, have
Mhm.
if they eat chicken, for example. That's just the most common, what people think dogs are allergic to. Some of them are, some of them are just sensitive to it, but they know. They're like, no, I don't feed my dog any chicken at all. And then we look at the ingredient label of what they're feeding, whether it's the food or a treat or something else. And I'm like,
Mhm.
well, there's chicken right there. Like they don't, they, it's, I think you
Yeah.
just get blind to the ingredient. You're looking at the first couple of ingredients, or you're looking at the front of the package that says that it's a beef recipe or that it's a salmon
Mhm.
and a rice recipe or whatever. And you're not really reading the ingredient label. Like people so often, almost every client I think I have ever had, not all, but almost all, I've had something like that in their diet where I'm like, okay, well, you told me you don't feed them this, but it's right here in this ingredient label. It happens all the time. And
Mhm.
it also happens when there are ingredients listed on the label that we actually don't know what they are. So it could say natural flavors.
Right.
And that's a big one.
Define, please.
what what flavor is it?
Mhm.
I don't
Mhm.
I mean, I think you and I both agree natural flavors are not amazing anyway. We don't want to see those, period. But if you're going to have it in there, at least tell me what that flavoring is supposed to be. What is it
Mhm.
derived from? So many don't do that. I remember, was it? No, it wasn't last year. It was the year before. I think I talked to somebody in the emerging brand section at Super Zoo, and it was a supplement for dogs. And their target market was dogs with allergies and food sensitivities and itching, scratching all the time. And the product had natural flavor in it. And I was like, how in the world? Like, I took the guy aside and I said, you realize that these dogs have food sensitivities. Yeah, that's why we have such a limited ingredient panel. Well, what is this natural flavoring? Oh, well, it's derived from blah, blah, blah. I said, that's great. But why am I going to buy this as a pet parent when you're not telling me what it is? Because I know my dog has food sensitivities, and then you're not telling me what this food is.
Right.
I mean, it's so bad that like manufacturers literally don't even think about it. Don't even
I
think about
I totally agree with you. It blows my mind because we are so, as just as a society, pet parents, we don't look at the minutia, the details, and we're not taught that for a reason, I feel like. Um, we don't question, the chemical additives, the food additives. These are chemicals. These are stuff that's formulated in a lab most of the time, like you're saying, a natural flavoring. And if you can't define what it is, then it was probably formulated in a lab to taste like something. Okay, so it's a chemical process, palatant, whatever you want to call it. You know what I mean? And pets can develop sensitivities to chemical food additives
it.
and food dyes and other things like that can cause behavioral issues, irritation, just being reactive, just like people who are sensitive to MSG. It can be very similar to that in pets. And I'm glad you pulled that brand aside, that rep, and asked him about that, because you're right. I don't think they even look past the major ingredients on their label when they get to the synthetic premixes or whatever, past the major stuff. They don't even give it a second thought, but they need to, because on a cumulative from a cumulative effect, all of that stuff could be having some kind of a detrimental effect in conjunction with something else on the label, or it could be contributing in some way to some irritation, irritability, sensitivity, a reaction of some kind, and they're just clueless, And the pet parents don't know. And you know what? In their defense, I don't think it's their job to know. It's the pet food manufacturer's job to know, and it's their job to inform and be transparent with their labels and their food and their definitions of what's in her food. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I feel like the onus falls on the manufacturers,
You would think.
first and foremost, it should, because they're putting themselves in a position of authority in creating something that your pet is going to eat. And we just go in with blind trust thinking that they know what they're doing. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't, and they can be very sneaky.
Well, and I think I agree with you. And it is a complete abuse of power
Mm.
because they are in this position. They have put themselves in this position of authority.
Mm-hmm.
And, we have been marketed to for so many decades at this point that we do just believe what we're told. We do just believe the commercials. And
Mm-hmm.
I remember 15, 16, 18, maybe, yeah, roughly years ago when Blue Buffalo was just like really hitting big.
Mm-hmm.
You better believe that I got wrapped into those commercials. Like, oh, feed them like the wild animal they are. Perfect. Let's do that.
Mm-hmm.
That's still their marketing. It is,
Yep.
dogs or wolves kind of thing. I mean, at the time, I was, cats and dogs, but it's all it is all marketing. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad you keep bringing up this definition thing. I think it's important for people to understand that AFCO is the regulatory body that comes up with definitions of what everything means on a pet food ingredient label, ingredient definitions. And it's not only that they don't match most of it, a lot of the time, they don't align with definitions of ingredients in human food, which
Mm-hmm.
in itself is confusing
And deceptive.
and deceptive. And I
Yeah.
think, again, I was just talking to Isabel today. We did our weekly live, and I tend to agree with her. She brought up a point that, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And oftentimes things do start out being,
Mm-hmm.
there was a good intention behind it, because there are a lot of things that go into pet food that would never go into human food. And so
Right.
defining them needed to happen. So I believe it started with good intentions, but we are at the point today where if you want to know what the definition of anything is on that ingredient label of that pet food that you're buying, $250. You want to buy the dictionary? You can. It is not available to us as consumers. We are
Mm-hmm.
being asked to buy a product that the definitions of the ingredients of it are behind a paywall. That
Right.
I think that would blow anyone's mind. Out of if you take nothing else away from our talk tonight, that's going to blow your mind. Like, I feel like you're going to be thinking about this for a while and telling people, did you know it's
It's
behind a
true.
paywall to know the definitions of the ingredients that are in your pet's food?
Yep. And they do not align with human food,
No,
the
they do
food that we
not.
eat. And
They do not at
that's
all.
very, again, it goes back to deception.
Yeah.
And it's not transparent. I don't think it's meant to be transparent,
Mm-mm.
because AFCO is really about the feed regulation, and that's where they started. It was about feed. Well, can you tell the listeners the difference between feed grade and food grade? Let's start with that.
Yeah, that is important. And it is something that I wanted to bring up tonight, because most pet foods, not all, but most,
Mm-hmm.
are feed grade, not food grade. So to be food grade, it has to be consumable by it has to meet standards to be consumable by humans. Feed
Mm-hmm.
grade, it has a totally different set of standards that is not like it would never pass to make it into the human food supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
But it is okay to be fed to pets. Now, in pet food marketing, on the labels, they are allowed to call any and everything they want food. There
Mm-hmm.
is absolutely no no what is the word I'm looking for? I
Restriction,
literally just ran out of my
restriction,
head. They
obligation.
don't, they don't have any obligation to tell us that it is feed.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that Susan Thixton has really dug her heels in on and presented to AFCO, and continues to push and push and push, is to make it a priority that they push ahead regulation that any bag of food that you buy, any can of food that you buy, either has to say that it's feed grade or food grade, so that
Mm-hmm.
we know. Because right now, we don't know.
Right.
I mean, you and I can look at a ingredient label and say that's feed grade. The vast majority of people cannot. They
Right.
don't know. So just being able to discern feed grade from food grade, and that's by design.
Yeah.
Because as a pet parent, if you look at a bag of food next to another bag of food, one of them says feed and one of them says food, and you're buying for your cat or your dog, when you think feed, you think livestock, right? You don't think cat and dog. You think
Mm-hmm.
you want to feed your cat and dog food. So,
Mm-hmm.
just like with anything else that we're going to talk about tonight, if they were actually honest and transparent with the fact that the entire, I shouldn't say entire, because there are some really great pet food companies out there.
Mm-hmm.
They are a pretty small minority in
Yeah.
comparison to the pet food market. Some of which I know you've had on your show, I've had on my show. They're amazing brands. The vast majority of the pet food industry is there, and AFCO was created to figure out what to do with waste from the human food industry. So
Mm-hmm.
that's what the regulation is there for. One of the things that I think is going to be of the utmost importance, and I hope it happens in my lifetime, but it may not, is I think there should be completely different regulatory bodies for feed and food.
Me too. I've said that for years.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. There should be completely different regulatory bodies for feed and food. Or if you want to keep the same regulatory body, different groups.
Requirements,
Yeah,
categories.
different
Right.
requirements, different group. Like it should
Mm-hmm.
be handled completely separately. And when I say food, that doesn't always mean that 100% of that has to be quote unquote human grade. Human grade is regulated. That is a term that is regulated in the pet food industry. And it's understandable for me. It's understandable that not 100% of ingredients are going to meet human food
Mm-hmm.
regulation. I mean, there are certainly foods, and there's a brand that you had on recently that doesn't technically meet that requirement, but I would eat. I mean, if it were made for me, I would eat it. And
Mm-hmm.
like their sourcing is just so incredible, but it just doesn't quite. I think there's like one or two ingredients that just don't meet the human food requirement. So I'm not a stickler on human grade food, but I do think there should be a huge differentiation in feed and food, and we should be able
Yeah.
to, that should be very clearly marked on a bag of food or a can of food that you're buying.
I totally agree with you.
One of
Yeah.
the reasons, and one of the things when you're looking at the ingredient label that I always hate to see, and I know I always think of Jay from Two Crazy Cat Ladies when I say this. I don't want to see meat meals.
Right.
I
Right.
don't. And I remember her going back. I remember her talking about the fact that there could technically be a higher protein content in a meat meal. Okay, I think that's splitting hairs. I think it's like, well, which of the bad things is least bad for you? kind of way to look at it, which is fine. You know, we have to address all angles. But meat meals are rendered animal parts that are not fit for human consumption. They're parts of the animal that humans don't eat, which isn't always a bad thing either, because there are animal parts that are biologically appropriate for our dogs and cats to eat that we just as humans wouldn't eat anyway, like bones, fur and feathers. We're not going to eat that, but it's biologically appropriate for our pets to be eating that. But it also contains 4D meats, which are dead, diseased, dying, and disabled animals. And I remember not too terribly long ago, there was a flood. I think there were multiple floods within a couple of years. And I want to say, if I remember this correctly, one of them was a pig farm. One of them was a cattle farm. And these animals, like the flooding took weeks to reside. And at the end, of course, all of these animals were dead. They had been out in the heat, in the waters, bloated for weeks. You know those animals went into pet food.
Yeah.
You know they did. And so when we say 4D meats, that's what we're talking about. And really interestingly, I actually had, I think it was a veterinarian, or her profile on Instagram said she was a veterinarian. When I posted about 4D meats on Instagram, she was like, they outlawed that in pet food years ago. You don't know anything. And I'm like, are you okay, lady? Because no, they didn't. That's like the point. That's the point of AFCO, is to put these animals into the pet food chain. Like that's what they're here for. So rendering is something that's kind of interesting in itself. And Susan Dixon actually very recently, I want to say it was last week, put out like a little infographic on what rendering is. And I thought it was kind of cool. So I brought Susan Dixon up twice now. She's at truthaboutpetfood.com. I'm sure Pam has talked about her many times, but you can check her out there.
She's awesome.
Oh my goodness, she's amazing. But rendering doesn't just happen in pet food. There is actually a rendering process that is used for human grade consumables as well. And they happen to start with raw materials that are byproducts of USDA inspected and passed carcasses. So these are fit for human consumption.
Right.
But they still go through the rendering process, and then they are used for like edible fats and soaps and pharmaceuticals and things like that humans consume all the time. There's inedible rendering. That's what goes into pet food. So these are meats that do not pass USDA inspection. These carcasses are condemned. They're inspected and condemned, and there is a statistic she has on here that coming from the USDA, more than 6.5 million livestock and poultry carcasses were condemned in 2024. So all of that went into pet food. Inedible rendering. So on her infographic, it says raw materials are sourced from fat and bone trimmings, inedible meat scraps, blood, feathers, and dead animals from meat and poultry slaughterhouses and processors, farms, ranches, feedlots, animal shelters, restaurants, butchers, and markets. I don't know if you caught that. Animal shelters was in there.
I did hear that. Let's think about that, guys. I mean, where do you think all those dead animals go? Yeah.
So inedible rendered ingredients, they are made into meat meal ingredients for pet food, for livestock feed, inedible fats for pet food and livestock, biofuel, and other industrial products. So nothing we would ever want anywhere around us. I don't
Right.
know why. I think the only reason pet parents feed this type of food is because they genuinely do not know what it is. Because if they
Absolutely.
did, I really don't think they would feed it. I really, really don't. So rendering is when they take the raw materials, they ground them to a uniform size, they place them in continuous cookers or batch cookers, which evaporate moisture and free fat from protein and bone. A series of conveyors, presses, and centrifuge continue the process of separating fat from solids. So, really cool infographic I would encourage you to check out on Truth About Pet Food. But when we talk about meat meals, that's what we're talking about. And one of the things that I think is important, again, I would much rather see chicken meal or salmon meal or, I don't know, bison meal, whatever it is, than just meat meal.
Identified.
Yes. When it is unidentified, and granted, there have been so many tests done on so many pet foods, and the vast majority of them always come up with DNA that is not listed on the ingredient label. So that, to me, like, we just have, that's a given at this point. But we need to do the best we can to narrow down what should be in that package to understand what we're feeding our pets.
Absolutely. And I agree with you. I don't think they really understand what's in it. I know that if I knew what was in it years ago and someone had explained that to me, I wouldn't, let me say it like this. Some people need a visual. If you need a good visual, get a Susan Dixon's Truth About Pet Food. She has photographs, like aerial photographs of these dead carcasses that are just in these huge containers, baking out in the sun, 100 degrees, or thrown onto the concrete, areas around these rendering plants. And they're just sitting out there decomposing. And it's disgusting. It's so disgusting. And just know that that is going to go into the rendering plant, into the big vats, and they're going to just cook it for, hours and hours and hours. And going back to what you said about the shelters, that is commonly how we have things like phenobarbital and other drugs ending up in pet food.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yep. All of those euthanasia drugs,
Mm-hmm.
and same for like sometimes livestock,
Yeah.
that's sick, or downed cows and, things like that. I mean, that's how those drugs, which are toxic, get into pet food and make pets sick. So is there any other part of the label? Can you give readers, or not readers, but listeners, some another good example of things that they can look at on their pet food label and they
Yeah.
think that it's one thing, but it's really not?
Yeah. So if you are looking at the front of the label, again, if we turn it back over and you see something that says, for example, beef dinner with salmon, whatever is behind the word with, that ingredient only has to meet 3% of the total ingredients. So beef with salmon, for example, salmon only has to be 3% of the total ingredients. So it's there, but I feel like that's pretty deceptive as well. And then the words dinner, recipe, and entree, which are very popular on cat foods, that meat or fish only has to be 25% of the total ingredients. So a pork dinner or a lamb recipe or a beef entree, those meats only have to comprise 25% of the ingredients. So a little bit better, but still not amazing.
Well, and here's where they get sneaky. So they'll put like rabbit dinner or turkey dinner, but then if you look at the label, let's say you're trying to avoid chicken.
Yeah.
Guess what? Just keep looking down that label. There's probably going to be chicken, chicken, chicken. It's like they put chicken in everything because it's cheaper than rabbit and venison, bison, whatever. And so they don't even have to say that on the front of the bag. They can call it rabbit dinner, and you're going to probably have chicken in it because they need to boost the protein value or the protein amount.
Yes,
it's
absolutely.
It's frustrating. So I guess one of my take-home messages for everybody is go buy you a magnifier.
Yes,
because they make that writing really small for a reason, and you just don't want to get caught, like, oh, I didn't know. Take your magnifier to the pet store next time you're shopping for your pet food and turn around and really look at it and read it, and just how many ingredients can you identify that might be starches or carbohydrates. Like, I was talking to somebody not too long ago, and I said, she was feeding a dry food, and I said, well, there are so many carbohydrates in this food. Have you read the label? And she's like, no. And I'm like, let's read the label together. And I was going through the ingredients, and she's like, oh my gosh, I did not know, because it's not listed on the guaranteed analysis. There's carbohydrates in that food. So sometimes the guaranteed analysis really isn't much help, because it doesn't tell you really anything about the whole nutrient profile of every single thing in that food. And there's very few brands that actually put that on their website. And so when I was showing her that, okay, here's a corn product, here's a rice product, here's brown rice, here's wheat, here's soy, and it was just like, her mind was blown. I said, your cat is eating a food that's between probably 40 to 60% carbohydrate. Yeah. And that's why they're having digestive problems, because they're not designed to eat that much carbohydrate. In the wild, what would you say, Jessica? Maybe 3 to 5% max in the wild. And that's because maybe they nibble on some grass, just, they need some fiber.
Yeah. And even what they get from the stomach contents of, say, a mouse or a rabbit or a bird is going to be partially digested, fermented. So much more easily digestible to begin with, because it's already partially digested, because it's already fermented. It's much, much easier to digest for a cat. So, there's a lot of talk, especially in the dog world, about feeding as a wolf or feeding as, a wild dog would eat. And, I mean, it sounds amazing, but also, we have the ability to do our best to mimic what they should be eating in the wild, while also having the opportunity to make adjustments so that we know that they're thriving. And I think that's an important distinction that we have, that so many of us don't take advantage of. Right. So, there's a lot of ideologies in feeding our pets. And I think more so in the dog community than the cat community, because I think the cat community is just, I think we're always a little bit behind the 8 ball as far as caring for our pets. I say it all the time that I truly believe that we misunderstand cats so much that we believe they're easier to care for than dogs. And I think it's completely the other way around. And I don't mean to say that to try to dissuade people from having cats, just in that I think we need to be paying more attention and being more intentional about how we are caring for our cats, because the negative effects of what we do and don't do. I mean, our cats should be living not only longer than they're living, but healthier than they're living. And food, I mean, there's a lot that goes into that, but food is definitely up there. I know, I mean, my cats, the 3 that I have left, they are, 2 of them are 16 this year. One of them just turned 17. And they, for the first couple, 3, 4 years, they definitely only ate kibble. Period. They had every vaccine under the sun. They got flea and tick prevention. They were dewormed constantly. I did everything my vet said to do when my vet said to do it. And I definitely see the repercussions of that, even though they have lived a pretty healthy, low tox life for quite a few years now. It adds up. It's coming out somewhere in the end. And again, that's not to say like, oh, well, I'm going to feel they're going to feel the effects of it anyway. Yeah, we can still lessen that. Like every day that goes by that we can do better makes a world of difference for them. But yeah, I don't know where I was going with that.
Well, okay, I'm going to circle back to something because I want to hear what you have to say about this. One of the things that I hear a lot of people in the cat space talk about, and almost like in a proud way. Well, she eats, my cat, she's on a grain-free diet. She eats the best, this grain-free, high quality dry food. And it's all I can do just to keep my mouth shut and not say anything negative, immediately, like that would be offensive. But I do end up telling them, well, you can probably guess what I say. But can you address, since we're talking about ingredient labels, the whole grain-free, like, why should cat parents be feeding grain-free dry food? Is that better than the corn, the wheat, the soy, and everything else? And how is that what are those grain-free ingredients called? Like, what are they standard? What's their typical go-to products?
Yeah.
And how are they digested? What are they digested as?
Yeah. So grain-free is loosely regulated as a pet food term. And what I mean by that is that, yes, if you claim a food is grain-free, it can't have grains in it. However, there is no regulation as to what those grains are replaced with. So they do have to replace them with something, and they replace them with usually legumes. They could sometimes be potato, but generally legumes, chickpeas, things like that. And it, in my opinion, they're both pretty bad. I think it depends on where you're doing your research, but grains are definitely hugely, like a huge portion of where pesticides and herbicides are coming from in the food. And legumes, depending on where you are doing your research, may even have more.
Right.
Like glyphosate and things like that, pesticides. So both are really hard on the digestive system. Legumes, specifically in large quantities, can actually have anti-nutrient properties.
Yep.
It's not meaning that they can kind of bind up nutrients in the food to where the body isn't actually getting those nutrients. It's hard to say if that's happening in grain-free diets or not. That's, I think, one of the reasons why taurine was added specifically to cat food a number of years ago, because there just wasn't enough from the food to begin with, because they're not really getting nutrients from the food. If you're buying a bag of kibble, they're getting nutrients from the synthetic premix that's being added, and there just wasn't enough taurine in there. If you're feeding your cat real food, whole foods, species appropriate foods, they're likely going to get enough taurine from that meat, especially if you're feeding heart. But there is concern, especially with dogs, that, and I think it didn't affect cats as much because of the increased requirement of taurine in the synthetic premixes for cat food specifically. So they weren't affected as much as dogs were, but definitely there was a lot going on, and they blamed grain-free diets. I don't know if it really was the cause of a lot of dogs having heart issues. There was certainly a lot of not so good stuff going on behind the scenes. There are still lawsuits going on around that whole thing. There are still veterinarians that preach to not feed grain-free diets. I think they're both bad, but in different ways. And for cats, yeah, I want them to eat a grain-free diet, but I don't want them to eat a diet that the grains were replaced with legumes.
Right.
Because cats, as obligate carnivores, their digestive system, they don't produce amylase to break down any of those carbohydrates, any of those starches. So their pancreas has to work overtime. Their digestive system is certain. I mean, I can't even talk to, I don't know, other than you. I don't know anyone that has cats that doesn't have some sort of GI issue going on.
Right.
Veterinarians, diagnosing IBD, which isn't a diagnosis, but that's what they call everything. And it's the food. It is, I mean, vaccines play a role, but it's the food.
Right. Well, and what I reminded the person the other day is all of the legumes in the dry food are plants, and cats can't I mean, they really can't utilize plant protein. They're carnivores. They need meat, they need animal proteins. And that's the type of nutrition that they need. And so just because you think you're feeding a grain-free, dry food diet and it's high quality, I just kind of laugh when people say high quality and then they put the word Purina right after that.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
I'm sorry. Yeah. I just have to laugh. I'm like, oh, okay. I remember years ago, I was talking to somebody in the workplace where I used to work, and he, bless his heart, he didn't know any better. He just said, well, my friend feeds her cat, or I feed my dog, or whatever it was he was talking about, a really good brand. And I'm like, oh, really? Which one? And he says, the Purina. I'm just like, sit down, we got to talk. I'm sorry to burst your bubble, but what makes you think that brand is good? And they go back to, we're going to circle back to what we talked about in the very beginning, and it was about the marketing and the commercials and all of that. That's what makes us think something is good versus bad. And so, yeah, we have a lot of education to do. So we only have like a minute and a half left. So is there anything that you want to leave our audience with before we wrap up tonight? This has been awesome.
I know that transitioning cats to new foods is difficult. I know. Believe me, I know. But it may be one of the most beneficial things you could ever do for your cat is to improve their food. As slowly as you have to do it, it's okay. Just start somewhere, even if it's with a freeze-dried piece of protein, right? Like start somewhere, start changing their taste buds, start changing their palate. And it really will be one of the most beneficial things you could ever do for your cat.
I agree, 100%. So Jessica, I know that you are a certified pet holistic nutritionist. Where can people find you if they want to reach out and get more information, or maybe do a consultation with you? We don't tell people where they can contact you from, or where they can find your website.
Yeah, JessicaLFisher.com is my main website. You can pretty much get anywhere from there. Book a call if you want to book a call with me. And outside of that, on social medias, Instagram is pretty much going to be the best place to DM me if you want to DM me.
Awesome. I have dropped your website in here.
Thank
So
you.
you guys feel free to reach out if you want a nutrition consultation. We hope you learned something tonight about your pet's food labels. And again, I challenge every one of you to go take your magnifier glass next time you go buy your pet food, wherever that might be, and turn that product around or that can around or that package, whatever it is, and start really diving into that pet food label and see if you can apply something that you learned tonight on the show. So thank you guys so much. Jessica, appreciate your time. This has been
Thank
awesome.
you.
So you guys, thank you for joining us. Share this out with someone who needs to know this information as a cat parent, and we will return next month for another show. So thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening. We'll be back soon.